Your 20s are an interesting time. Your brain's still developing and yet your fertility is peaking. You go from the structure of school into the wide expanse of adulthood where you have to manage time and conceptualize it. You feel anxious at work despite having graduated from college and university and perhaps excelling. The reality of the physical changes occurring to your brain and your body during this decade explains a lot of the behaviors that we exhibit. But when armed with this information, one can use it to optimize their 20s for the outcomes they want. Hey, I'm Adama, and in this video, I'm going to unpack the final section from the book, The Defining Decade, entitled The Brain and the Body. We'll unpack ideas such as confidence in the workplace and dating, how to actually conceptualize time so you can make the most out of it, the realities and the statistics of fertility and changes to your body, and so much more. So let's just get into it. The first chapter in this section is titled Forward Thinking. Now, the thing is, the frontal lobe is one of the last parts of the brain to develop in humans, but it's responsible for rational thought that balances and regulates feelings and impulses. It's where we tackle uncertainty, especially uncertainty associated with time, and where we do things like forward thinking effectively, where we make decisions not only based on how we feel in the present, but what we're hoping to achieve in the future. It's really interesting because studies of people who have damage to the frontal lobe have shown, whilst their intelligence may remain the same, like an ability to solve a math problem, their actual ability to make rational decisions based on personal circumstances or social settings does take a hit. They make choices in friends and partners and activities that go against their best interest and find it difficult to see an abstract goal in terms of concrete steps. And whilst you may be thinking, well, what does that got to do with me in my 20s? Well, if your frontal lobe has not fully developed, we may start to see some of those similarities in decision making and rational thought. And this understanding is really important because if you graduated kind of like me and you was wondering, well, why could I be so successful here and yet struggled in this new career adulting space to transfer those skills? Like, one, I was really good here in getting the grades and doing this, and yet now I'm in this space and it's not translating as well. And it's because you're looking at different skill sets, right? They're not the same, which is why somebody who could have aced everything may struggle once they get into, the world of career, of dating and things like that. Or why you're thinking that people who didn't do as well as you in school are now outpacing you, running circles almost around you. Rather than this being an excuse to make no decisions in your 20s and kind of act wild, the author Meg Jay argues that this isn't just a function of brain development, right? Like your ability to forward think and make rational decisions, it's also a function of experience and practice, like so many things in life. And therefore one should be inputting, time and effort into strengthening, that ability to think in a certain way in order to have the outcomes you want in the future. And if you're not convinced that this skill can be harnessed over practice and experience, just consider people in their 20s who seem to really have it together, right? Despite the fact that their brain is still developing, they seem to really be able to get a hold of the idea of delayed gratification. They make decisions now and sacrifice now for further outcomes. And some people in their 30s, 40s and beyond never seem to quite get it together, despite the fact that their brain may be fully developed, right? Because they haven't practiced that skill, they haven't been implementing it in their life and getting better at it through experience. This continued brain elasticity, if you'd like, in your 20s is one of the reasons why your personality or the way you behave can change so much during this decade, and why it's so important what and who you surround yourself with during this time. Because just as when you are a child and you are picking up things from your environment such as language, behavior, actions, gestures, in your 20s, you're still doing this. But because of this, because of how malleable our brains are and how open we are to new information and understanding, it is a time of great risk and great opportunity. The next chapter is entitled Calm Yourself, and it opens with a great quote. When we start something new, we don't know what we're doing. That's the biggest challenge, right? So many of us, myself included, have been caught off guard because we expected to be able to do something, be really good at it relatively quickly and start excelling. Only that's not how life works. In this chapter, we meet Danielle. So Danielle has got a job at a television production company, right? She's an assistant for somebody very high up, but she is struggling every day. She is anxious every day, stressed. She is worrying about the most minute activities, and she's struggling to reconcile the structure and the way she was able to excel in school with this new environment. And she basically wants to quit every single day. Meg argues that she's actually right where she needs to be, And that if in your 20s you feel overly comfortable in a job, you're probably either overconfident or underemployed. That being, you should be seeking out things during this period that challenges you, right? That sets you or forces you to push the boundaries comfortably to an extent of what you can do. Not so much that you push the boundaries that you fall off, but you know, that you are stretching yourself. Otherwise, you just remain in this zone of comfort where we know not much happens. But going back to Danielle and those feelings of stress and anxiety over sometimes the smallest thing like a typo in an email, the thing about our brains they're wired to remember events that are associated with strong emotions, typically whether those emotions be very strong in a negative sense or strong in a positive sense, which is why we kind of recall those bad times so much and why then it becomes the source of so much stress and anxiety. And whilst this is the case for humans across the board, it's specifically strong in people in their 20s. And moreover, the leaning towards those negative emotions is far stronger than the positive ones. So you have a catalogue of these negative emotions and events associated with them that are feeding into those negative feelings that you have. And the author draws on this quote from a man called William James, right? And he says, "The art of being wise is knowing what to overlook." Right? As much as it's knowing what to focus on, it's knowing what to not focus on and stress about, and being able to, rationally make sense of an event that occurs despite what you're feeling emotionally about it. Meg compares moving from youth to adulthood as moving from being a leaf whereby the slightest change in the environment has a big effect on you, either sending you soaring through the sky or dropping to the ground. And yet the older you get, the more you become like a tree, rooted and grounded, and therefore less susceptible to changes in the environment. Probably one of the best quotes from this chapter is that our attitudes and reactions are the last of our human freedoms. We cannot control all of the events that occur in this world. In fact, we can't control most of them, right? But we can control how we respond to them, how we react, and how we let our emotions dictate or not dictate what we do next. And so she speaks about using facts and objective realities to ground yourself when you start to feel overwhelmed. So when you send an email to the wrong person at work, or it takes a little bit longer than usual to get the response that you wanted from your partner, from your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whatever the case is, rooting yourself in facts of the moment of, okay, the person could just be busy, or I've sent the typo, I'll just send another email if it's not legible. Or most people probably know what I was trying to say. Or, okay, I did this thing wrong, let me correct for it, make sure that people understand that I know where I've gone wrong, and move forward. And of course, this is a hard thing to just say just to do, just override your emotions with facts, because emotions are so powerful. But that's why practice is so important. And the way you handle every situation is key to building up those skills of being able to root yourself in reality versus, blowing in the wind with feelings. The next chapter is called Outside In, and like most of these chapters, opens again with a brilliant quote. "Inaction breeds fear and doubt. Action breeds confidence and courage. If you want to conquer fear, do not sit home and think about it. Go out and get busy." And that's from Dale Carnegie. And I think this is a great quote, and it's something that I touched on when I did my video on self-doubt a few months back. Are you really suffering from self-doubt and you feel like you can't do these things? Or are you just not getting out there and doing the things? Going back to Danielle, she describes the people in her workplaces just being confident, like naturally they have something that she doesn't have. And it's what's referred to kind of in psychology and also consulting as the fixed mindset. This idea that you believe things are fixed, humans are just as they are. Some people have that, just that natural thing, that amazing thing they're born with, and some people don't, right? And as you can see, having that fixed mindset can cause problems, especially if you come face to face with challenges, as all humans do. Juxtapose this with the growth mindset, which is the idea that things are more malleable, that people can change, that they can learn things, that they can grow effectively. And you see why when faced with a challenge, these two mindsets will result in very different outcomes. It's all good if you have a fixed mindset when you're doing something you're already good at or that you get really quickly. But the moment you come across something that is harder, that requires more time and effort and, kind of this delay before you get to being excellent, well, then you have issues. I like to liken this to the I can't do maths mindset, right? This idea that if you tell yourself that you can't do something, it's fixed, there is no room for change, then the likelihood of you being able to change that thing and better it is slim to none, because you have already placed yourself in a position where I can't make this change because it's not possible. And the brain is so powerful, our mind is so powerful in allowing us to do certain things and grow in certain ways, that fixed versus growth mindset often determines the path that people are on in life. What's really important in this chapter is the idea that confidence doesn't come from the inside out, but actually comes from the outside in, contrary to some of the things we may have been told. And it links quite closely to, if you've read Atomic Habits by James Clear, the idea of identity creation, right? This idea that in order for you to feel confident about something, you need to provide your brain evidence that you can do this thing. The more evidence that you have, the more confident you feel. It's why you feel so, comfortable and relaxed doing certain things you've been doing for years, that you have success in, versus when you start something new. Your brain and you effectively have no evidence that you can do this thing to a high degree. Therefore, why would you have or expect a high degree of confidence in it? I think the moment you accept this, the more you can put your energy into not feeling that I can't do anything and my confidence is low and this is where I am, but in doing the work required to become that confident, competent person, right? And it links to something called the 10,000 hour rule. This idea that anybody who is great at anything, from being a piano player to being a writer, has probably put in 10,000 hours or more to get to that level, right? This idea that the idea of a prodigy or some sort of born with it genius is less common than people who are just doing the work. So if you are at work or whatever you were in and you're struggling with these feelings, think about it. How many hours have I already put into this? If you are on day one of the job, like I spoke about it myself, doubt video, and feeling like I can't do this, well, that's because you've been here for 3 hours. How are you going to have become, the top mastery of this particular thing? You literally don't have your login details yet, and yet you're saying I've got to quit. The next chapter is entitled Getting Along and Getting Ahead. Love and work are the cornerstone of humanness. Freud. So in this chapter we meet Sam. Now Sam is kind of just everywhere in terms of where he lives. He lives out of a backpack where he has some clothes and a toothbrush, going from sometimes his parents, a friend, to another friend. His career is kind of replicating that as well. Like, he doesn't have a stable job and hasn't had one for any time in his 20s. He's moving around a lot and he's really just feeling, as he says, like he's not a man. The world doesn't see him as a man. And what Meg uses this story to illustrate is that we feel better about ourselves, not by running from adulthood, but by investing in it. Right? By doing things that, again, make us feel like we are moving forward, like we are achieving things, and that we have tangible things to hold on to, right? Whether that be our home, a career, a family, a partner, whatever those things are. Believe it or not, 20-somethings who are employed report feeling happier than those who are not. And while some of us are like, I'm not trying to live this 9-to-5 life for all of my life, you can understand where having a sense of working towards something, whether it be your own business, whether it be working for somebody, will cultivate meaning, right? You're putting your effort and energy into goals that you are trying to achieve, whatever they are. 20-somethings that don't feel like they're getting along or getting ahead are anxious. The reality is, even if you're not at that perfect stage, you're not at your dream job or your dream relationship, just working towards it, just knowing you are on the path, will help you feel better. It will dissolve a lot of those anxieties of feeling kind of in the middle of nowhere, like in the middle of an ocean, as we saw in some of the other chapters, and instead feeling like you're on a course, wherever that course is going, however windy it may be, you're there. She then goes on to talk about this kind of getting along and getting ahead in terms of relationships, right? And contrary to the belief that being single is where it's at and where everyone is the most happiest, it's actually the case that when people in their 20s were interviewed, those who were just kind of in the hookup culture, were never really committing and things like that, reported again feeling less happy than those who were in relationships. That isn't to say that all of these relationships are healthy and perfect, but that was the case. And very few of them said that they would rather be single and out here in these streets than in a happy relationship. So going back to Sam, his stumbling block was that he thought he had to be these things before he could enter the world and start living. Not knowing that you have to enter the world and live to feel those feelings of confidence, of competency, and as quote as he felt, being a man. So after some time working with Meg, Sam did actually get an apartment. He got a dog, which was really fundamental in changing his life. He had that dog when he was younger and he loved it to bits. He then started to walk dogs and get involved with an obedience trainer. He was an assistant to one, and that led on to him a few years later actually opening up his own doggy daycare center kind of thing. And, you know, with ambitions of expanding. He was also in a relationship. And he speaks about it wasn't until he made those steps and got out there to get ahead and get along that he started to feel those emotions that he had yearned for this whole time. The next chapter is entitled Everybody. And just as a warning, this chapter is concerned with fertility and the changes in your body that happens from your 20s to your 30s to your 40s. And we'll talk about things like children and not being able to have them. So if you're uncomfortable, please skip this chapter. We are at a point in human history where people are having children later. And in fact, 1/3 of first-time mums are in their 30s, which is a lot different to a few years ago, where people were having children typically in their early 20s. Add to this mix that for the first time in human history, women outnumber men in the workplace, and you can see that there are a lot of things impacting the decisions that are made about the timeline for marriage and children. But given this, when surveyed, most people in their 20s said that being a good parent and being a parent in general was one of the highest priorities for them in their life, one of the most important goals. So with an acceptance that many of us do want children one day and would like to build families, it's important to recognize how this relates to the changes that will occur in your body during your 20s and beyond, for both men and women. The author Meg is open about the fact that she had her children in her mid to late 30s, but it wasn't smooth sailing, and reflecting back she realizes how lucky she was to be able to have those two children that she did, when really faced with the sober realities of the statistics, the likelihood of being able to get pregnant and stay pregnant beyond a certain age. And here we meet Caitlin, who has, I would say, a rather sad story. Caitlin is in the office of Meg, the author, and they're talking about a lot of things, and the idea of children come up. At this time, Caitlin is 36, and when Meg says, oh, okay, so what about children? How are you thinking about this in terms of fitting into your life? And she responds to the effect of, she hasn't really thought about it, or she hasn't really decided on this yet. And Meg makes a really good point here, which is, you don't want to find out children are important to you just as you no longer can have them. And whilst we see headlines of people in their 40s and 50s sometimes having children, or celebrities, what you don't hear is about all of the people who don't, who can't have children, who kept waiting and putting it off, or weren't sure, and once they were sure, they found out that it was going to be a lot more difficult than they had anticipated. And Caitlin's rebuttal to a lot of what Meg was saying was, well, she knew people in their 40s. She had a friend in her 40s who had just had a child, and she was spouting off all these celebrities who had children. And what she was really kind of embodying was something called the availability heuristic. This is the idea that we base how likely something is on our ability to recall an example. Well, because Caitlin was able to quickly recall that example of the 40-year-old who had had the child, all of these celebrities, she was kind of equating that to the likelihood of that being her outcomes, rather than really looking at the statistics, the facts, and the data that had been collected around fertility for women. Whilst there are always going to be outliers, the stats are quite clear. Fertility peaks in your 20s. By 35, it drops significantly, and by 40, it almost plummets. Caitlin, who was with Ben at the time, her partner, was saying that she wanted to push off having children because she planned on having this elaborate engagement period, wanted to plan for a huge wedding. She obviously wanted a few years, she said, after she gets married with her husband, and so she'd get there eventually. Well, she did all of this, and at around 38, she started to have, wanted to plan for a baby, and so they were trying for a baby. And after a year of not being successful, and it was expected that, well, we're going to see a specialist now, fertility specialist, and things will happen. Again, this just wasn't the case. And this kind of idea links back to this. We hear about people who go through fertility treatments and are successful, and so that feeds into what we think is most likely. But we don't hear about all of the times that it isn't successful, which is a lot. The reality was that Caitlin wasn't able to have children in the end, and her sessions with Meg became more about grief than anything else. And I think it's an important lesson, and I don't think it's necessarily about scaremongering, but it is about coming face to face with the reality and the facts that are in front of you. If you then decide to make decisions about waiting and waiting and waiting, then that is of course your prerogative, but at least now you can do so with the knowledge at your hand that I am taking an increased risk potentially as I get older. And so taking that information and planning effectively, even if you don't want children in your 20s, you want them perhaps in your early 30s, at least you've planned for that and you can like measure, the realities of your outcomes. The final chapter is entitled Do the Math. To achieve great things, 2 things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. The thing about the brain is it has trouble keeping time over long periods that have no intervals, that are not punctuated by defined events or an understanding. As alluded to earlier, when you move from the structure of school and education where, you have terms, you have the summer break, spring break, you have certain hours in the day, where time is structured for you into being an adult where you manage it, there can be real issues in this transition here. And this transition mixed with something called present bias is where 20-somethings can really start to trip up. Present bias, as the name may suggest, is the idea of you hold a preference for the outcomes in this moment, right? And so maybe you don't make decisions on 5 years because you're biased to what's happening now. This is especially true when you're in your 20s because seeing 30 seems so far away, especially if you're in your early 20s, right? So making a decision about saving more now for retirement or saving more now for, that house you want to buy at 30, it's so far away. I'll get there when I get there. And remember, of course, that part of our brain responsible for forward thinking is still developing. You now add into the mix the narrative of just have fun, you're only young once, right? Like do all this stuff in your 20s. And all of this kind of mixes to create quite a storm of present bias. And it's why 20-somethings often struggle to anticipate life. In this chapter, we meet Rachel. She dropped out of her masters because she kind of wasn't feeling it. She now works at a bar, working nights, followed by partying, followed by getting up pretty late, kind of just, falling out of bed at whatever time she wants. But she says to Meg she feels distracted, like she can't really get things done. When asked why, what is getting in the way, she quotes things like errands, boy dramas, and marathons of Law and Order. Now, I was kind of triggered by this one, I won't lie. But this present bias is amplified by what we surround ourselves with and who. If you're also with people who are not considering, time and the future, then it kind of leads you to think, it makes sense what I'm doing right now. And when Rachel is talking about wanting to attend law school, eventually get married and have a family, it becomes clear that the maths is not mathing. Like it's not adding up, right? She wants to have children before a certain age, but also wants to go to law school before getting married and having children. She doesn't want to be pregnant in law school, understandably. And so when Meg lays this out to her, this timetable, she's like, maybe I need to get it together now if I want to go to law school. Instead of this idea that everything's so far off and there's an infinite amount of time for everything. And she ends this chapter with a quote from Irving, an author who's asked, how do you come up with all these great stories? How do you do it? And he says, I always begin with the last sentence, then work my way backwards through the plot where the story should begin. And that's kind of what you have to do, right? In order to start making moves forward, you kind of need to know where you're going. It doesn't have to be perfect and it can change, but it's like knowing that I want to get an A. That is my end goal, and therefore I start to take actions towards that. Or I know I want to get here in my career, and so then that's my end point, the last line of the story, and I can work backwards towards that. Or I want to be married with children by a certain age, right? And so then again, working backwards towards that. Effectively, happy endings are intentional. They are not these things that often just happen. They take action and thought. So that's it. This was the final section in the series, The Defining Decade. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I had a great time unpacking this book, reading, taking notes and sharing it with you guys and hearing your responses. It has been amazing. The 20s are a great time. And I will finish with this quote from kind of the end of the book, in the hopes that you take it with you and you decide to take what you want from this book, right? You can take what you want and leave what you want. This isn't about knowing it all. This isn't about replicating word for word what a book says in your own life. The future isn't written in the stars. There are no guarantees, so claim your adulthood. Be intentional. Get to work. Pick your family. Do the math. Make your own certainty. Don't be defined by what you didn't do or didn't know. You are deciding your life right now. I'll see you in the next video.